You are about to listen to the full interview with Ralph Blumenthal. Sections of it were originally included in our two-part UAP episode. If you haven't listened to the full episode, we recommend you go listen. It'll provide context for this interview. Ralph Blumenthal had a long career working as a reporter at the New York Times. Together with Leslie Kean, he brought the explosive story about a secret government program that had been quietly studying UFOs, regardless of the government's public denials of any such program existing. He later helped bring the incredible story of David Grusch to the public spotlight. His reporting has led to multiple congressional hearings being held on the subject of UFOs. We spoke with him about how he came upon these stories and what the future may hold for disclosure.
My name is Ralph Blumenthal. I spent 45 years on the staff of the New York Times covering organized crime, Nazi war criminals, investigative reporting, corruption, the cops. I'm now a distinguished lecturer at Baruch College of the City University of New York. And I teach summers at Phillips Exeter Academy International Summer School program for kids from all over the world. And I continue to, freelance and write for different publications.
And so you've written pretty extensively and done some amazing reporting on UAPs. How did that interest first spring up for you?
Well, it all started really with John Mack. In 2004, I was the New York Times correspondent in Texas, based in Houston. And I happened to pick up a paperback of a book I'd never heard of by an author I'd never heard of, Dr. John Mack, a psychiatrist at Harvard, who got very interested in UFOs and alien abduction encounters, stories told to him by patients. And I thought this was pretty interesting that, esteemed Harvard psychiatrist would be interested in an offbeat subject like that. And I thought the book was really interesting. I thought I'd give him a call for an interview. He was already very famous, which I didn't know, infamous in some quarters, but certainly renowned for his psychiatric expertise and interest in this offbeat topic. Anyway, a few days later, I picked up the paper to see he'd been run over in London and killed by a drunk driver. And that really started my interest. I talked to his family. I got access to his voluminous archives. He was a tremendous saver of material. He'd done an awful lot. We can talk about his contributions. And that got me started. I spent 17 years, researching and writing this book, The Believer, about John Mack. And in towards the end of that time, in 2017, a series of events occurred with Leslie Kean that got me interested in, updating the story with news of a secret Pentagon unit that was investigating UFOs. No one knew about it. We can tell that story anyway. So that kind of overlapped, but those were the two important events that got me interested in this topic.
Yeah, and actually, let's maybe jump into that article that you wrote, because I feel like that really was kind of the resurgence for the modern interest in UAP phenomena and the public's perception. Can you maybe talk to us a little bit about that article and kind of give us a little summary of what you uncovered through your reporting?
So in 2017, I was hard at work on my John Mack book, and I had gotten to know Leslie Kean, who was the premier UFO researcher in the country, probably in the world. She wrote a book about pilots and generals who have gone on the record with UFO sightings. And because of my research into John Mack, I'd gotten to know her. She'd been very close with Bud Hopkins, who had got, a top researcher and artist, really unlike John Mack, who was a professional, psychiatrist, somebody who studied the workings of the human mind. Bud Hopkins was an artist, but he got interested in the subject. Anyway, he was the one who got John Mack interested in the topic. And Leslie was very close to Bud, who was dying of cancer back in 2011. Anyway, so I got to know Leslie while I was working on my UFO book, on my book on John Mack. And in 2017, Leslie went down to Washington in around September or so, October, and attended a meeting where she learned about the secret UFO office, UAP office inside the Pentagon. It had gone under different names, OSAP originally, and then ATIP. The head of it was a guy named Lou Elizondo, an intelligence guy, who had just submitted his resignation because he wasn't getting enough support from the Pentagon. But this unit, unbeknownst to anybody outside the government and many people in the government, was secretly studying UFO encounters and taking video. So it showed that the government was interested, even though in, end of 1969 with the Project Blue Book, it said that there was nothing to investigate. And the government was officially dropping its interest in UFOs. That wasn't true. So anyway, so Leslie found out about this secret Pentagon office and came to me with information about it, and I took it to the Times. I'd left the Times in 2009 after 45 years, but I still had good contacts there, and I told them that this was a sensational story about a secret government unit that was investigating UFOs and that the director had just resigned. So it was a great story all around, and the Times went for it without much prodding. We had it all on the record. There was no secret sources. We had Lou Elizondo's performance evaluations. We had, chapter and verse. So there really wasn't anything to take on faith. The Times saw it was a good story and ran with it. We partnered with Helene Cooper, the Pentagon correspondent. So she had very good sources in the Pentagon. And she went out to interview Harry Reid, by the way, the Senate Majority Leader, who had gotten the money for this, secret $22 million in secret money for this Pentagon office. Anyway, the story broke in December 17th, 16th, I think, online, 2017, and it really was a kind of an earthquake.
While you were researching and writing the story, what sort of documents, video, or other evidence did you see to corroborate the writing that you were doing?
First of all, we had to authenticate Lou Elizondo's record, and we got his performance evaluations. There was no doubt he was who he said he was, an intelligence agent. By the way, he was still under a lot of classified restrictions, so a lot of the programs he'd been involved in and the operations he'd been involved in were classified. But we saw enough of his evaluations to verify that he was who he said he was. Plus, we had eventually 3 videos, short snippets of encounters between Navy jets and UAP that we revealed for the first time. Now, they were short, videos of much longer videos, which we couldn't see. But what we saw was not classified. What Leslie was shown and brought back to me and we took to the New York Times was not classified. The Times put them up. They, to this day, they are shown widely. They were a sensation. They were the most widely viewed videos, I think the New York Times may have ever put up, because they were so mysterious and they showed these objects, whatever they were. And by the way, I want to emphasize that much of this is very mysterious. We did not provide answers, nor did we, say we did. We don't claim to have the answer to this mystery. All we're saying is that these, which is what the government eventually acknowledged, by the way, that these objects are real. Whatever they are, they're not hallucinations, they're not, images of clouds, as so many so-called skeptics have said over the years. They're not, weather balloons, or all these kind of nonsensical explanations, contortions, which have been resorted to throw people off the track. These are real objects that can perform extraordinary aerodynamic feats, which is what, freaked out the pilots. And by the way, these are the best observers, in the world. These are not just ordinary people who happen to see something in the sky. These are highly trained, fighter pilots. And they were saying that these things resembled nothing known on Earth in their aerodynamics and the way they could turn on a dime, change direction, disappear, operate underwater, apparently, because some of these things was seen churning underwater. So that's really the story of what we took to the New York Times and why the New York Times went for it.
So you're saying it's definitely not swamp gas?
It's definitely not swamp gas. It's not fly specks on the windshield. It's not mental illness. By the way, John Mack dealt with all that too. He had a lot of skeptics and his accounts, by the way, we did not deal with alien abduction at all in the New York Times account. That was a totally different dimension of research that I dealt with in my book, but that all we said in the New York Times were that these were real objects, or appeared to be real objects that could do extraordinary things, but we did not speculate and have not speculated in the New York Times or anywhere else on where these things may be coming from, who's behind the wheel, why they're here. That's another element of the story that we can talk about, but that was not part of the New York Times reporting.
Yeah, obviously there's a lot of stigma, and has been a lot of stigma around UFOs. I think even more stigma around the topic of alien abductions. And I'm curious to know, like, how did that work? And does it feed into any of the new government revelations that have come out about the secret programs? Has there been any revelations about the UFO abduction phenomenon as well?
Yeah, well, the government's been very careful not to stray into speculation. And it did come up, we can get to this in a discussion, but it did come up in the last hearing with David Grusch, the former intelligence guy whose story we broke, Leslie and I, in the debrief website. But the government has not said anything about where these objects may be coming from, why they're here. Presumably they're intelligent because they can do these strange maneuvers that are not known on Earth. And by the way, all the people we've talked to and who have testified have pretty much discounted the idea that they could be adversarial, China, Russia, any other earthly power, because they can do things that are just not known on Earth. They can achieve extraordinary speeds, plunge down to the water and sometimes underwater, turn on a dime, don't seem to have any means of propulsion, by the way. They've been eyeballed by people like Dave Fravor, who testified before Congress, a pilot who saw one of these things called the Tic Tac, like a giant rounded, Tic Tac candy, no wings, no tail, no plume of propulsion. But the government has not speculated on, where they think these things are coming from. Are they extraterrestrial? Are they intelligent? Because, again, nobody knows.
Yeah, the recent term of non-human intelligence just makes the whole story feel almost even more mysterious, because you're left speculating, if it's not extraterrestrials, what could this possibly be?
Exactly. I mean, that's sort of the conclusion you're left with, but no one is saying it officially because it involves a leap that no one in the government is willing to take at this point.
Could you maybe give us an overview of what the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program was and just kind of what their goal was?
Yeah, it started off, as I said, as ORSAP, another acronym, and it was an office inside the Pentagon that was analyzing these encounters that Navy pilots were having with these craft. Some of them were happened on the West Coast off San Diego, some happened on the East Coast off Virginia, and Navy pilots were sent up to encounter them, and came back with extraordinary stories, some of which we reported in the New York Times. There was one really strange story about a sphere, a big round, sphere that looked like it had a square inside it. The corners of a cube inside it. The corners of the cube were touching the inside skin of this round thing, and it cut a path between two Navy jets. It scared the daylights out of one of the pilots, who reported to our source, who told us a story afterwards. Guy came back and he was white as a sheet. And Ryan Graves, the pilot, who also testified before Congress, asked this guy what happened. He said, he used a few choice epithets, that this thing came between him and a fellow pilot and was very close, and he could not figure out what it was. It was very, very strange. But he definitely got a good view of it. So, that was one of the stories we were eventually able to put in the New York Times.
When you first saw the videos that came from the Nimitz, which are now referred to as the Tic Tac video, kind of what was your first reaction to that? And then also, maybe a quick follow-up on that is how did that come into your hands initially? I know you said it wasn't classified, but why wasn't it released earlier?
Well, Leslie and I don't like to talk about how we get certain things. And, other people have said things about, how they supplied this information to the New York Times. We're not going to talk about that. Let's just say that when Leslie went down to Washington and met with Lou Elizondo and others, and Chris Mellon and some other top people involved in the ATIP program, both inside and outside, she saw the videos and she was able to get 3 of them. As we said, they're not classified, that we got them electronically. I mean, it was not like, film, like canisters. We're dealing now in the digital age. So everything is, digital. So we got these videos and we took them to the New York Times, and we were amazed because you could hear the voices of the pilots talking about them, on the video. Oh my God, look at that! And they're following this object. And they were in one of the videos. They were trying to zero in with the camera of the jet that they were in. They were trying to zero in on this object skipping along the waves, or it looked like just above the water. And then when the camera fastened on it, you could hear the joy in their voices. So they were very excited. We were very excited to see that. And Helene Cooper, our Pentagon colleague from the Times, who had the videos too and was running them on her computer down in the Washington bureau, she drew a tremendous crowd in the bureau. They were all, clustered around her, staring at this video. And until then, she told us afterwards they were kind of making fun of her, some of our colleagues, doing like spooky music sounds, this was all, fantasy or something. But when she put the videos up and she was looking at them, they all clustered around and they were freaked out, as anyone is looking at them. I mean, to this day, they've not been debunked, despite the fact that so-called skeptics have tried to throw doubt on them or explain them as, all kinds of different things, but with no success. They remain completely mysterious and authentic in terms of this is what the FLIR, cameras, the imaging devices on the Navy jets picked up. So my reaction was, like everybody else, oh my God, what could these things be? One of them, it looked like a top, like a gyroscope spinning in space, and it was turning at one point. And that's what attracted the attention, because when these things were first captured, these images, and shown to other pilots on the Princeton and other ships that were part of the battle group, that went out in search of these UAP. The Navy personnel who saw the images were freaked out as well. Everybody has to be looking at these things. I mean, you can't not be, completely absorbed and wondering what the hell these things could be.
How did ATIP get its funding? How much did it cost to run this program, and where did the funding come for this program?
Well, Harry Reid got the funding. Harry Reid was an interesting player. As a Senate Majority Leader, first of all, he was very brave to come out to us. A lot of people in Congress, now it's loosened up, but back then, back in the early 2000s, and certainly before that, it was kind of a kiss of death for anybody in Congress to say they were interested in UFOs, because the opponents would make fun of them. I remember what Jimmy Carter went through when he said he had seen a UFO, and Gerald Ford got hearings going and, was subject to some ridicule for that. So the stigma was still very much part of the picture. So Harry Reid, as the Senate Majority Leader, had the clout and he had the interest. He had heard stories himself from colleagues, Ted Stevens of Alaska and Daniel Inouye of Hawaii, with two other members of Congress who were very intrigued by these stories, which had been circulating for a long time. I mean, this hasn't happened. This is not something that happened only in recent years. This has been going on, as we know, since the beginnings of the Cold War, World War II even, and before that. So these stories have been around, but no one was courageous enough in Congress to really grapple with the implications and see what it was all about, and whether it had any meaning for national security and, future of humanity, big questions like that. So Harry Reid was intrigued by the stories he'd heard, and he got secret funding, $22 million, to fund this Pentagon office, which I said, OSAP, ATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, because all these things are tied in some way to national security. That's the way you get money. You get Congress to appropriate money. You don't get it because you say this is altruistic, this is good for mankind. You present it as a threat to national security, which in a way it certainly is, because there's a technology operating here that nobody understands. And if it falls into adversarial hands, it could be very, very detrimental to American security, for sure. So it's not hard to imagine that, the way to get funding for these programs is to say, hey, there's something up there in the sky that we can't explain, and maybe underwater, that defies our best defense technology, and we ought to know about it. So that was the springboard to him getting this secret funding, and that's what started it.
You said this funding was secret, so they weren't open about the funds and how they were being spent at the time.
It was very, the Pentagon budget is huge, obviously, and there's all kinds of cutouts. So it's not easy to find any particular appropriation in there, and some of that is for good reason. They don't want, obviously, adversaries to know what we're researching, how much money we're spending. So this money was buried in the budget. It was not flagged in any way for outsiders to see. As a matter of fact, this is one of the complaints of David Grusch, the guy who just testified with two pilots in the latest congressional hearing. He said there's things going on with the budget, all kinds of games that are being played with the budget that Congress needs to know about, should know about, and is illegally withheld from knowing about. So there's all kinds of shenanigans going on with money being shifted from one pocket to another that the American people should know about, that certainly members of Congress who are, charged with overseeing the spending, even at the highest security levels, someone has to know what's being spent and how, but they weren't being told. So this was not something that we at the New York Times or anybody else could have found on our own, this $22 million appropriation. It was deeply buried in the Pentagon budget in a way that no one could ever find it.
Yeah, since this has become more public in the reporting on it, we found out that a good amount of that money went to Robert Bigelow to help do research. Can you talk about who he was and kind of what his involvement in the funding was?
Yeah, Robert Bigelow, who I wrote up in a separate piece in the Times because he was very interested in a wide range of paranormal activity, including survival of consciousness and life after death. Robert Bigelow is an aerospace entrepreneur, a billionaire, who made his money in the hotel business. And he made so much money and was so interested in aerospace that he built up his aerospace business to the point where he has a habitat in the International Space Station. He designed an inflatable habitat. It's very small when it gets sent up to the space station, but then it expands, and it's a place where astronauts can live and expand their housing at the International Space Station. So he's very technically adept. He's very innovative in terms of his aerospace business. And he was very close to Harry Reid. He supported Harry Reid. He's also from Las Vegas. And so when Harry Reid got this $22 million appropriation, it's one thing to get the money secretly appropriated for research, but you got to get somebody to do something with it. Otherwise, the money just sits there. What good is the money if you can't apply it? So he needed somebody with the programs and the infrastructure to know how to use that money. And a good part of that $22 million did go to Robert Bigelow, not in any corrupt way that we could find, but because he was legitimately an expert in this field. He had the habitat at the space station. He had Bigelow Aerospace. So it was not like, this guy who had no connection to aerospace technology getting a windfall of money. First of all, it wasn't even that much money when you think of the money needed to do research in this field. It's very obviously very expensive to set up these cameras and to send up jets and all that anyway, and to analyze the results. So Bigelow did get a good portion of that money, but he put out a lot of reports, many of which were public, by the way. He farmed out the money to different university professors who did all kinds of research. So we know where some of that money went. Some of it remains classified, so we don't know. But there was no suggestion that it was misspent or, siphoned off improperly.
What was the Pentagon's response after your article came out?
Well, it's very interesting. The Pentagon can be very literal at times when it wants to be. And it basically knocked down the story, or tried to, by saying that, the denials are always very carefully worded. The Pentagon has no evidence that UAP are extraterrestrial. Well, that's true. There is no evidence that they're extraterrestrial. It's an inference because they can do things that nothing on Earth can do. But if you look at the denials, and especially over the years, over the decades, the Pentagon has been very disingenuous in sharing its information with the American people, which is what, the American people are entitled to know stuff about this program as long as it's not classified and, if it doesn't involve national security. But the fact that there may be extraterrestrial intelligence operating in American airspace is not necessarily a national security, issue. It's something that belongs to all of humanity, not just Americans, but all of people all over the world should know if there's been contact made with some technology that we cannot explain. We don't need to know how it works or what the technical details are, how it can be reverse engineered. But the fact that it exists, you might say, is something that really belongs to all mankind. So the Pentagon responses, I never put much stock in because they seem to be very carefully worded to non-denial denials, you could call them. And, Lou Elizondo later had I think he even has a current pending case against the Pentagon for, claiming things about that, disavowing his positions in the government and in the Pentagon. And we have established to our satisfaction, New York Times satisfaction, that he is who he said he is. But there were forces in the Pentagon, and this is what came up at the hearing just recently, a few weeks ago, that seemed bent on undercutting these accounts and undercutting witnesses.
At some point, the Pentagon started calling UFOs UAPs. Why did they change the term, you think?
Yeah, UFOs, just like flying saucers, the original term, came to have a sort of a sensational connotation, and UFOs sort of inherited that, and they wanted to get away from that, so they came up with first it became unidentified aerial phenomena, and then because these things didn't only seem to operate in the air, they seemed to operate underwater, they became unidentified anomalous phenomena. So the Pentagon keeps shifting its terminology, and I guess that's welcome because the phenomenon seems to be, the more we understand about it, is more mysterious than ever. It's not just confined to the skies, as I said, but underwater in other media, notably the ocean. So that's why they changed it. And I think they wanted to get away from the term UFO, which had this sensational connotation.
What was the biggest challenge in getting this article released?
Well, there's a stigma to this subject. You have to convince, skeptical editors that you're not dealing with fantasy here. You're not dealing with, we're not talking about aliens. We're talking about technical phenomena that have been documented, caught on thermal imaging cameras and eyeballed by, very highly trained pilots. So you have to convince people. I've done a lot of research in this field now. I started in 2004 with my John Mack research, but a lot of the so-called skeptics have not done this kind of research. All they know is that this can't be true. And, on some level, it can't be true because it's so wild and so hard to imagine that your first reaction is, this can't be true. I agree with that. It doesn't make any sense. How could a craft come from millions of light years away, presumably, and the distances are mind-boggling. How could that be? So the skeptics have had a field day just throwing doubt into the subject. But the more you study it and you look at the actual accounts of people like Dave Fravor and Ryan Graves and David Grusch, and ordinary people who have no axe to grind, who have over the decades have come forward with these accounts. And if it was just one person, you could write it off and say, well, it's just one farmer, in Ohio who was confused by the lights of an airplane. But millions of people have seen these things close up, and law enforcement people and experts and astronomers have all reported similar sightings. So, anyway, I've gone off on a rant here, but I guess I'm angry at that the skeptics have so often, seized the debate by saying, how could this be true? And of course, they're right. I mean, how could this be true? And yet, the more you study it, the more you see that there's something going on here that remains a mystery.
After your article came out, what was the direct result of this reporting?
I think a lot of people followed it. I mean, I'm happy to say I think the article was bulletproof because the Times was very careful. We didn't make any great claims. As I said, we didn't speculate on where these things had come from or how they got here or who, what kind of intelligence might be operating these craft. We strictly stuck to the fact that we had a very highly, people whose records were unassailable, intelligence people who were given tremendous responsibility in other fields coming forward with this information. We had their service records. So very, very credible people. So as far as I'm aware, people tried to knock it down, by the way. So-called experts out there were saying, well, these images could be this, it could be that. But nobody successfully debunked the story, which is why it carried such weight. And other publications, jumped in. Some were right with us as we were reported this. ProPublica was very close to us in its reporting. They had gotten some of the same information from Lou Elizondo and others, so it was kind of a race who would get the information out first. I think we beat them by a little, but and a lot of other publications then followed.
Yeah, I mean, I think this reporting has had such far-reaching effects, positive effects. I mean, honestly, even the modern whistleblower movement that we're seeing, I think, has been propped up and helped by this reporting and taking away the stigma of UAPs. Could you talk about the UAP task force? Because I feel like that followed pretty shortly after and kind of what that was.
After ATIP, and the money ran out pretty quickly. It started, I think it was funded in 2007 originally by Harry Reid with this $22 million under the original name of the program, OSAP. And then the money kind of ran out very quickly. So the government then instituted a number of other units to continue the research. And one of them was the UAP task force, which, by the way, very little is known about. I mean, it was not public. The heads of it did not talk to the press. We couldn't interview them. So all we knew about was that there was this unit, and eventually it came out with a report, a report to Congress, which said, interestingly enough, that these objects, and this is the first time I'm aware that the government has said this, that these objects are probably real, that they are not illusions or hallucinations or fabrications, hoaxes, or misidentifications of aircraft. There's something up there that was real, that the government could not identify, and that could do all these incredible aerodynamic maneuvers. So that was the first report of the UAP task force. Came out in, I think, 2021. I'm blanking on the date exactly, but the government, Congress, to its credit, in the defense authorization bills that it passed, required the Pentagon to report periodically on its research. So again, that was the first time the Congress was holding the administration to account to report to the American people what it could. Now, some of that reporting was to the Congress classified. There were two tiers. There was the public reporting, and then there was the classified reports, which we have never seen. We didn't try to get a hold of. We don't want to go to prison. Leslie and I have been very careful to confine our reporting to what is public. We hear a lot of stories, we poke around, but we understand that there's a lot of classified material in this field, and we don't mess around with that.
Your article in 2017 was just such a bombshell, but I feel like your more recent article was even more amazing and shocking in terms of the information that's revealed. Can you kind of give us an update and summary of that article that you've published in June 5th, 2023, and what that was about?
Yeah, so after our 2017 article, we did a number of other articles in the New York Times, including Close Encounters with some of these UAP that we quoted pilots like Ryan Graves and Dave Fravor about, which zeroed in on the strange nature of these things and the fact that the pilots were encountering them all the time. Navy pilots, Air Force, Navy was more forthcoming than the Air Force, but Air Force pilots too. And then we another story we did for the Times really mentioned for the first time, as far as I'm aware, that the U.S., that Congress had been briefed about supposed recoveries of craft that had crashed. And that was a very difficult story to get into the New York Times because it had to be very carefully documented. And we interviewed the guy who said he had briefed Congress about it. And we never heard back from Congress on it because they couldn't talk about it because it was classified. But anyway, so we did get a story into the New York Times that raised the question of whether any of these craft had been actually recovered, which we believe to be the case. And then earlier this year, Leslie made contact with David Grusch, a high-level intelligence guy, who claimed that the government has been holding recovered craft. He knew this, he says, from contacts he made in the government, information he got, privileged information. He got from various sources. He did not himself, witness these crash retrievals. He didn't put his hands on any supposedly recovered craft, but he gave a good enough account to be really interesting to us. And we checked him out like we had checked out Lou Elizondo, and his bona fides were very clear. Again, we didn't jump into this without very carefully vetting him. And we took that story to the Times. They weren't interested at that point, or they not interested enough to run it. And we talked to the Washington Post, and they were interested in the story, and they were going through all the steps that they would take before they'd run the story. And then a bunch of things started happening that changed our timetable. Grusch was getting threats. His name leaked out. We were very careful to keep him confidential until we were ready to break the story. He was always going to go on the record, but it had to be in the context of the story once it was fully laid out. But his name leaked out on the web. He was getting threats. It was getting very uncomfortable. So we broke that story in The Debrief, which is a very highly regarded website. Leslie and I had written for them before. They had their own vetting. They had a lot of experts, former intelligence people and defense people. They're very close to the defense industry, so they have very good people working for them. Anyway, so we broke the story of David Grusch, who said, again, for the first time at that level, that American intelligence knew that intact craft and pieces of craft, but also entire craft, had been recovered and were being held in undisclosed locations. So that was the story that really, again, kind of moved the needle.
He mentions that we potentially are in possession of craft, but he also says that maybe we're in possession of non-human biological evidence, I believe is the way they put it. Could you elaborate a little on that and kind of what he said?
Well, he didn't say that as a part of the interviews with us. See, what we did, we found out, and again, I think this really goes to his credibility and the credibility of our story. When Grusch was talking to us and was preparing to go public, as a former intelligence officer, he was compelled to go to the government and get clearance for what he was about to say. There's a whole Pentagon office of, I forget the acronym, defense clearance and whatever. But there's a process that intelligence people have to go through if they don't want to break the law and go to jail, that they have to submit their information to a clearance office to make sure they're not disclosing classified information because they don't want to go to jail either. So Grusch very meticulously and properly went to this office and said, I'm talking to reporters, and I want to say that I know from my contacts that the U.S. is holding intact and partially intact craft, not of human manufacture, among other things, and he received okay to do that. Now, that didn't mean that the Pentagon said, okay, we agree that you're telling the truth. What they said was, well, we have no security grounds to block you, okay? In other words, you're not disclosing anything of a prohibited nature. I think that's an important distinction. So they weren't endorsing his information. They were just saying we're not stopping you. But on the other hand, if he had been saying something that was in any way contrary to law, they could have stepped in and said, you cannot say this. But anything he told them that he was going to tell us, and then we saw his application to this office for clearance, and the answer they gave was that we have no interest in preventing you from saying this. So, and by the way, he was represented by a former Inspector General of the intelligence community, Chuck McCullough, who was the first Inspector General of the intelligence community, a very high-level guy who is now in private practice. So that also lent credibility to David Grusch's information, because presumably a lawyer who was, a very top intelligence official would not lend himself to a fabrication. Anyway, so we had Grusch's account of what he was going to tell us, and we had the fact that the government had no quarrel with him telling us that. And alien bodies was not part of that. He said that later in another interview, and I'm not saying it's true or it's not true. I'm just saying that was not the information that he submitted to the government for vetting, and which we stuck to, and I think strengthened our report. What he said was sensational enough, that the government had, a craft not of this earth. And he also said other things, that Congress had been lied to, and Congress had not gotten the proper information, which is potentially criminal, by the way. And I think Congress is looking into that there are pockets in the government and out of the government where this information is being held outside of proper channels. And the government really, the Congress has a mechanism for handling extremely sensitive information. There's the Gang of Six, a Gang of Eight, I think, the chairmen and chairwomen of different committees. But Congress is supposed to handle the most secret information, at least to know about it. And this information was not shared properly with Congress, is what David Grusch complained. So, in other words, there are pockets where this information, and we encountered this in our reporting, there is super, super, super secret little corners of the government where information is being kept and projects are being run that are outside of all oversight, proper oversight, special access programs where there's a mechanism for supervising them, and it's not being adhered to. Anyway. And this holds true for contractors and parts of the Pentagon and all kinds of places. So we don't know very much about that because it's all deeply, deeply classified. Anyway, so that's what Grusch brought and what we stuck to in our report.
Yeah, one of the things that sticks out to me about Grusch is that a lot of the information that he has doesn't seem to be firsthand knowledge. It seems to be what he's heard from others. Was there any concern on your part in reporting on the story when you didn't necessarily have video footage like you did from the original article you published?
Yeah, well, that's always a problem, in this field, that ideally, as a reporter, you want to, you want to be shown the craft. You want to put your hands on it. You want to send it out for testing. But it doesn't work that way in this field. And you just have to say that no, we don't have the craft. We don't have the pieces to be analyzed. But the next best thing is, who's making these claims? Are these people credible? Is there any secret agenda that they have? Who is saying the opposite? Who's knocking it down? And again, we came up with the fact that Grusch was highly decorated. He'd served in Afghanistan. He was highly credible. And there have been efforts, by the way, more recently to take him down, to shed bad light on his mental state and this and that. As many soldiers who've served in Afghanistan and other war zones have encountered, he had some problems as a result. He got treatment for that. It didn't affect his service in the government. He was still highly placed. But, now people are using that, some people, to, cast doubt on what he had to say. We don't think it has any real relevance to his information, which, as I said, we carefully vetted. And I think there are going to be other whistleblowers coming forward now to to add to that story. So that's the next step, which we and a lot of other journalists are pursuing.
Yeah, that's actually what I was curious to ask you is, what do you think is the next step? And you've touched on it a little bit, but, looking forward to the next 5-10 years.
Well, I think there are other whistleblowers. The whistleblower legislation was written into the National Defense Act. There was a mechanism for people who had information in this field, specifically the field of UAP, who had information. There was a mechanism for them to provide that information to Congress, not to go to the media, not to, go on television and talk about it, but to provide it to certain agencies and bodies equipped to handle this information. And they couldn't be prosecuted, no matter what their earlier agreements with the government were. If they had information about secret programs that were relevant to Congress, that Congress had not been told about, they were protected under this legislation, which was authored by Senator Gillibrand and others, and it was written into the Defense Act. So there are other people out there who have this information, we understand. Some of them have already talked to Congress. We don't know what they said because it's classified. And Grusch gave 1,100 pages of classified testimony to Congress. We don't know what he told Congress in that testimony because it's classified. But there are others who either have or will be or may be coming forward now to provide that information. And the question is, at what point might they come out and talk publicly? That's the answer to your question. That's the next step.
You've written a number of books on the UFO phenomenon. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that work, kind of what you've written, if our listeners want to follow your work and anything new you're working on in the future.
Great. Well, the most recent book my wife and I collaborated on, it's called UFOs, OHS, Mysteries in the Sky. It's the first, as far as we're aware, nonfiction book on UFOs or UAP for children. It's a picture book beautifully illustrated by an artist who worked with my wife, Deborah, on another book. It's really a way for parents and teachers and librarians to grapple with this very difficult subject on an early level. I mean, it's said for children 6 to 9, but really it's for any young person who's encountering this field or seeing stuff on TV, which is pretty sensational, and wants to know about it. And it's a way of bringing up the topic. So we're very proud of that book. It just came out a few months ago. We're doing a lot of talking about it in different groups and, UFO festivals to acquaint people with it. So that's the most recent book. And my last book, as I said, was the book that got me started in this field in the first place, which I was working on when the Time story came up in 2017. I'd already been working on this since 2004, which is The Believer. It's the story of John Mack, the Harvard psychiatrist, who really stumbled into this field because of the stories that people were telling him about paranormal encounters that he could not explain with all his psychiatric expertise. These people were telling very credible stories of encounters with alien beings, and he could not figure it out. But from the way they were telling the stories, both under some enhanced. John Mack didn't like really to use hypnosis, but there were relaxation techniques that enabled people to encounter memories that had been repressed, let's say. And the way they reacted when they retrieved these memories was so convincing to John Mack that he believed that they were telling the truth, that they had encountered some extraordinary phenomena, alien intelligence, whatever, and very detailed accounts of being taken aboard spacecraft and subjected to medical procedures. But so many of these stories tracked each other. There wasn't just one story, but it was a whole, system of stories that were kind of congruent, different yet similar, that convinced him that something had happened to these people that he could not explain. And he didn't pretend to understand. Early on, he kind of leapt to some conclusions, which I talk about in the book, that maybe were premature. And the whole question came up was, were these experiences real, or did they happen in some other dimension? And initially, he, like Bud Hopkins, were convinced that these were real, that they happened in actual real time in some kind of reality. Later, he wasn't so sure, because the more you go into this field, the more complicated it becomes. That's really a hallmark of this whole business, that the people who claim to have the answers, the so-called skeptics, who are quick with a solution and an answer, are really misrepresenting the complexity of the evidence. And there is evidence. It's fragmentary. It's difficult to get your hands around. Places where UFOs were seen to land. It did show some evidence of disruption of the landscape. People had scars. Second and third parties witnessed some of these encounters. So, it's not totally without evidence, but the evidence is difficult. And that's, again, a hallmark of it. But anyway, that was the story of John Mack. And of course, he ran into trouble at Harvard. The Harvard establishment wasn't happy with that, with his increasing fame. He was going on. He went on Oprah to talk about this, and everybody said, "Oh, he's a Harvard psychiatrist who believes in aliens." And so Harvard put him under investigation. In the end, they basically cleared him, that he hadn't done anything wrong. He was a little too enthusiastic, but he hadn't, violated any of Harvard's rules and regulations. He was, he was never uninstated there. And then he was run over in London by accident by a drunk driver, as fate would have it. But I had all his records, and he was an extraordinary man. I think he was very courageous to take on the establishment, because he knew that he was going to ruffle a lot of feathers, and he did.
What's the best way for people to find your books if they want to check them out? And what's the best way for them to follow you if they want to see what's coming up next?
Well, I have a website, ralphblumenthal.com. Everything is laid out there. The books are all listed there, interviews, contact information, ways to email me. The books are available, The Believer and UFOs, both on Amazon. There's audio books, there's Kindle. So today it's very easy. You don't have to walk to the bookstore or go to the library. You can do everything online. But so the books are easily available. I
might try to squeeze in one more question here, since we have a little bit of time. Something you said there earlier about Hopkins thinking about that these potentially may not be physical experiences happening, and maybe something that's happening in another dimension. That's something that has come up in the congressional hearings as well. I believe Grusch said something along those lines, that these could be interdimensional craft. Can you talk a little bit more about that and kind of what you're feeling and what you've learned through researching on that topic?
As I said before, the more you go into this, the more complicated it becomes. And only the people who haven't invested appropriate time and effort to look into this phenomenon are quick with answers, which in my mind are not available at this point. We just don't know. So there's many strange aspects to these craft. Some people see them, other people don't. Two people together, one person may encounter this, another person may not. It seems to operate not by the normal laws of physics that we understand. Certainly the aerodynamics of these craft operating underwater. I mean, I talked to a guy, Bob McIver, an intelligence guy, who told me he was on a submarine some years ago, a Navy submarine, when something blew past at the speed of sound underwater. Now, that seems to be an impossibility by the physics we understand, that because of the resistance of water, nothing can approach a speed of 700 miles an hour on land. I don't know what the speed of sound is underwater, but let's say 700 miles an hour underwater. Nothing can do that given the resistance of water. And yet he said that was his experience, and other people saw it on the submarine that he was on. So there are many unanswered questions, obviously, about the physics of these objects. How can they do what? How do they traverse these extraordinary distances if, in fact, they're coming from across the universe or across the cosmos? Or are they coming from some dimension that's folded in on our dimension? Are they right next door? That was another hypothesis of the whole UAP phenomenon, that they're not coming from light years away, but they're existing right next to us somehow in another dimension. It sounds like mumbo jumbo. and a scientist would say, well, how does that exactly work? And I'm not a scientist, and I can't explain it, and I don't think scientists can explain it. But we know that, given enough time, our understanding increases of the phenomena of the universe. And there are many things that we don't understand, that we didn't understand before, that we understand now. There are many things we don't understand now that we may understand in the future. But it's not a static thing that, we now know everything that there is to know. That would be complete hubris. So there may be other dimensions. There may be other ways that these things exist and don't exist at the same time. And that's what we have to keep our minds open to. Again, if you have any kind of smarts at all, you enter this field with complete humility. And it's only the people who are diehard, they call themselves skeptics, but they're not skeptic, because a true skeptic is open to different possibilities. These people have their minds set that this is complete nonsense. And, it's hogwash and it's ridiculous. And it is ridiculous, but not in that way. It's just something that we still need to figure out. And at least if you're devoted to the search for truth, you've got to compile the evidence. Just look at the accounts that people have given and evaluate it and try to figure out, well, what might fit this, this range of experiences. That's all.
Ralph, thank you so much for your reporting on this topic. I think it's super important to keep this topic in the public's perception and not let it slip away, because this is such a if what we're seeing is true, I mean, it's truly one of the most important things in entire human history. So, and I would be such a shame for it to disappear again. And between the era we've had Project Blue Book to now, for it to fade away like it did before.
I think it's too late for that. I don't think that genie can be put back in the bottle. I agree with you that I think it's got to move forward, maybe in fits and starts, but people are demanding to know. So whether disclosure is something that's going to happen in, 6 months or 6 years, I mean, who knows? But I think we're on the right track.
A special thanks to Massimo Teodorani for allowing us to use his music as the underscore for this episode. You can listen to more of his music under his artist name, Totem Tag, on Bandcamp. A link is in the description. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on your favorite podcasting app. It helps get this content in front of more listeners, which means we can produce more episodes more often. Visit our website at www.strange-phenomenon.com for a full list of sources and more episodes. Strange Phenomenon is hosted by Ray Tarara. It's written and produced by RJ Blake and Ray Tarara. Theme music by Tara Monk.